Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
So you have the pleasure now between a North American accent and a British accent, but it's going to be English nonetheless. We clearly have the sexiest subject in this whole conference. We're going to talk about blockchain. Those of you who were here last year, remember we did a bit of a Q&A where I was asking the room who's heard about blockchain, and a lot of people actually didn't raise a hand. 12 months later, I would expect that most of you have heard about blockchain. So what we'll ask you now is, who actually thinks they understand the relationship between Bitcoin and blockchain? Who thinks that blockchain could be interesting for an organization like a bank? And do you have an idea how? Cool. So hopefully we can demystify a little bit here. Barry, I'm going to ask very simply by putting you on the spot, when was the first time you heard about Bitcoin?
Can I ask a question of the audience as well?
Go for it.
All right, great. So by show of hands, on the spectrum of Bitcoin skeptic to Bitcoin believer, put your hand up if you're a Bitcoin skeptic. Put it up, okay. Hostile audience. Okay, anybody, any believers? Put your hand up if you're a believer. Okay, there are some believers here. Okay, how about, who owns Bitcoin? Put your hand up. I'm not going to rob you. Okay, great. So that's interesting. So my Bitcoin journey is funny. Everybody has their own journey. Mine started in 2011. My background, I was an investment banker. I started a Fintech company, and in 2011, I read an article about something called Silk Road, which was a website where you could go buy drugs and do other bad things. And the primary currency was something called Bitcoin. Price of Bitcoin went from $1 to $10 or $20 or $30, ultimately crashed. And I found the idea of this decentralized, non-government controlled created money a really interesting idea. But I completely dismissed it as this is crazy, it's drug dealers and bad people, it's going to go away. But I kept on, like every month for like 9 months, I was like, okay, it's not going away. Why are people interested in this? And I started talking to economists and cryptographers and just people in the space. And ultimately, I became a believer. And in 2012, I started buying Bitcoin below $10. So that was a good trade so far.
So if you fast forward 6 years, why are you uniquely positioned to talk about Bitcoin today?
Well, I decided a few years ago that I was so passionate about the potential for digital currency and Bitcoin to change the world that I was going to dedicate the rest of my career towards it. So I stepped down running my last company called Second Market, which ultimately sold it to NASDAQ, and I started building a company called Digital Currency Group. And so Digital Currency Group is our mission in life to accelerate the development of a better financial system. And we do that by investing in companies, by starting companies, by buying companies. And so far, we've invested in 85 companies around the world. I think we're about 25 countries now. We have 2 investments in Mexico, which hopefully we'll get to talk about. We've started 2 companies. We bought a company called CoinDesk, which hopefully everybody reads. It's the leading news site for the industry. And we've also raised money ourselves from some pretty interesting investors like MasterCard, like Western Union, Foxconn, folks that are just trying to figure out what does this mean to them and how, should they be scared shitless or should they be embracing it? And we have a really, really amazing network of entrepreneurs and investors, and really our role is to kind of connect all those dots.
Wonderful. And just to add color, so with Startupbootcamp Fintech, we run at the moment 3 Fintech programs in London, Singapore, and New York. We're on accelerators. We get per year probably about 300 to 400 applications per location, which means we see, just in the fintech programs alone, about 1,200 startups every year. And by now, about 30% of all the applications we receive, about 30% of all the businesses that are looking to come into our accelerator are somewhat blockchain related, which is fascinating, right? We also have a dedicated blockchain program in Switzerland called Nexus Labs. But the interesting thing is that although we see a lot of exciting stuff, we see very little quality. So we see a lot of people who get fascinated by the technology, but they become technology looking for a problem to solve, right? So we both have a slightly different perspective, but the landscape is still the landscape, right? So what is it that excites you when you look at a Bitcoin company or a blockchain company today, when you feel this is really this has potential, this is quality, this is depth.
Right. Well, let's take a big step back, and what is Bitcoin? And this term blockchain has become very popular recently, but really Bitcoin is three things. It's a currency that, in my opinion, is similar to like a digital form of gold. It is a rail on which value can move around the world, and it's this distributed ledger system, also known as blockchain. Candidly, my enthusiasm started off and is still really around Bitcoin as a currency, and now, thanks to companies like Abra, in which we're an investor, as a rail. We've invested in 18 different exchanges around the world, in places like Mexico and India and the Philippines and Nigeria, and we're seeing exponential growth in transactional volumes of people now using Bitcoin as a rail, who are not actually getting or taking exposure to the price of Bitcoin. There's services like Abra that are making that happen. And so, when we look at companies, we start off at the seed stage. And so, as you know, it's really all about the people. So, first and foremost, it's, we want to back fantastic entrepreneurs who have demonstrated success in their life. So it's people first, then it's what's the market opportunity they're going after? What is the problem they're trying to solve? And then three is their solution. When you come into the seed stage, easily a third of these companies are going to pivot into a completely different business model. A third of them are going to change their solution. And so really it's all about backing the best people.
If you see, because first of all, does the definition of Bitcoin with the three different things make a little bit more sense for those of you who actually don't know the relationship? I mean, if you want to simplify, blockchain is the infrastructure on which the currency runs, right? And when people get excited by the whole thing, they don't necessarily make the distinction, right?
Or realize how interdependent they are on one another.
So people get excited about blockchain, but they don't want, especially the bankers, they don't want anything to do with Bitcoin, right?
Crazy bankers.
When we did the Q&A at the beginning, Paul asked the different profiles, but he didn't ask who in the room is actually from a bank.
Okay, you can admit it.
It's okay.
You're from a bank. It's okay. We like banks.
We're nice.
Can I give you some insight to kind of what's happening? So it's really interesting. So I mentioned Bitcoin is a bad word. I've been involved in the space since 2011. We've invested in all these companies, and I would say, Bitcoin continues to raise red flags internally at banks around the world. But I can tell you, really, for the first time ever, we're now starting to see financial institutions, both in the U.S. and abroad, open to the idea that digital currency, whether it's Bitcoin or otherwise, creates real efficiencies in both their systems and cross-border payments, and are starting to experiment. And I really do think it does not take many of them to go public with their interest, their openness, for the narrative to completely change. Because once you do get very excited about a public ledger like a Bitcoin, like an Ethereum, you come to appreciate that the reason why it's so powerful and it really can change the world is because it's secured by people who are basically processing transactions on the network who are being compensated with Bitcoin, the miners. So you cannot get excited about the Bitcoin blockchain and its applications around clearing and settlements of financial assets or identity or Internet of Things or digital rights management, all these fantastic opportunities. You cannot get excited about that without also being excited about the underlying currency, the token, Bitcoin. And that's separate and apart from Bitcoin as a speculative investment in a world where we have negative interest rates, 13 trillion of negative yielding debt. The peso is devalued 30, 40% against the dollar in the past 3-4 years. Argentina, Venezuela, around the world, you look at currencies that are losing value, and we're only getting started. And so the idea of digital money that a central bank doesn't create or control is a very, very powerful idea that I think, separate from blockchain, separate from identity, all those cool things, I think in and of itself is going to be a very, very important thing from an economic perspective going forward.
And Greece. I'm Greek, I have to mention it.
Well, let's talk about Greece. Like, was it last summer, 2 summers ago? When was that? 2 summers ago. So 2 summers ago, the system basically gets shut off from the entire financial system. PayPal shuts down, Western Union shuts down. The banks don't allow you to take money out of your bank account. If you had a safe deposit box, if you had money in your safe deposit box, you couldn't get access to it. Unfortunately, Bitcoin had not really taken off in Greece yet, so it was not a solution. But it really was, I think, a perfect advertisement for something like Bitcoin in Greece.
But the reason I mentioned Greece is ultimately we want to talk about the difference between, say, the established economies that have maybe a little bit more history and feel maybe a lesser need for using Bitcoin, and then putting it against emerging markets with a lot more instability. So if you look at your experience globally, and if you look at the specific needs of the infrastructure here in Mexico and the landscape, and the players that started emerging, what do you see? What is it that you think is going to make a big impact in the next couple of years?
Excellent. Perfect softball for me to plug my companies. Great. Okay, so...
That was not agreed, by the way.
Okay, so one of our core themes of investing is we want to invest in the infrastructure that's being built around the world that will enable the conversion of Bitcoin in and out of local currencies. And so that means you need wallets, you need exchanges. So we invested in a company called Bitso here in Mexico, which is the leading exchange for Bitcoin. They're now working with financial institutions, corporates, family offices to help them utilize Bitcoin as a rail. We also invested in a company called Mifiel, which is using the blockchain for a very interesting non-financial application. They're using it for electronic signatures and basically hashing those signatures in the documents into the blockchain. They're working with insurance companies, working with banks to solve a very unique problem that exists as to why does DocuSign not exist or is not used in Mexico. They have a very, very unique solution for that.
So if we look at the spectrum of the doubters on the one hand and the real believers on the other hand, what do we need to do to nudge the doubters along, to get them a little bit closer to understanding, to be less scared, less worried, and understand the potential, the true potential that lies in that?
Well, I think a lot of people are skeptical initially about Bitcoin and digital currency because it's not represented in physical form, and people seem to think about money in the form of kind of paper bills. Now, we all know that we are going to a digital money society over the next couple of decades. In fact, in my office, I just turned 40 a few months ago. In my office, essentially everybody younger than 30 years old doesn't carry around physical cash anymore, which blows my mind. I would never leave home without having physical cash. So I think a lot of the reason why people are skeptical to begin with is because Bitcoin was really one of the first examples of a digital form of money that was not represented in physical form. But if you get involved in Bitcoin, you tend to become a bit of like a money historian. And I'll admit I read books about money, history of money in my free time. And if you look at the history of money, money has taken lots of forms over history. Money has been rocks, it's been salt, it's been wampum, it's cigarettes in jail. It is what society decides it is. And so I've grown up in a world where money is represented by physical bills, which really have no intrinsic value in and of themselves. So ultimately, if you look at the history of money, over the past 400 years, the average life of a currency is 27 years. And within 27 years on average, a currency will become worthless through war or more oftentimes through debasement. So that is what's happening around the world today. So I think to kind of move people from the skeptic side to the believer side, I think it's education, I think it's awareness, but I also think it's really just a matter of time. I have never met anybody who has kind of gone all the way to believer and then said, you know what, I've been reading more about it, I just don't believe this anymore. Like everybody it's like a ratchet, you kind of go this way, and once you're here, you tend to want to support it, you tend to want to buy it, you tend to want to use it, and a lot of people are hoarding it.
There's so many avenues we can take this now. I think because we've been asked to cut down a little bit of time, maybe it's a good opportunity to get actually people in the audience to ask a question or two, especially if you're on the non-believer side.
Yeah.
This is Shamir from the BBVA Open platform. By the way, Barry, I am one of those people who went all the way to being a believer and then came back. So you know one at least.
Believer to back?
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you guys think that a currency whose value fluctuates as wildly as Bitcoin has, either appreciating or depreciating, can ever form the basis of a sort of a stable retail payment system?
So I think the answer is it can form the base of a financial system on which hedging and other products live that mitigate the volatility risk. Candidly, those don't exist today. They will exist. But I think, a very unpopular opinion I have is, there's 10 billion of Bitcoin in circulation right now. It's not gonna dent the world. It's not gonna provide any of these solutions at $10 billion. There really is going to have to be 100 billion, 500 billion of Bitcoin in circulation. And more importantly, you're going to need a lot of volume and velocity at the end of all the corridors, all the exchange points. So I actually think a bit of a flywheel has to take effect for ultimately for Bitcoin to kind of serve as that global financial currency and payment system. So price starts going up, people start making money. When people have money, they tend to spend it. More merchants want to accept it because more people want to spend it. Merchants are not going to go long Bitcoin, so they can convert out of it. It creates more velocity in trading. You then have around the world more corridors open up, like Mexico and India and Philippines and all throughout Africa. As more corridors open up, you then have the ability to move money around the world faster, cheaper than the alternatives. But none of that is possible with 10 billion of Bitcoin in circulation, trading $500 million a day.
There was one more question here.
Do you see yourself paying your employees in Bitcoin over the years? Because it's one thing to accept payment, but people need income to pay.
The question was, do we pay our employees in Bitcoin?
Yeah, right now or in the future?
Yeah, so we don't currently. It's really just been a priority for my controller to set it up. We've been talking about it, and in fact, we just talked about it this week. So we will ultimately make that available to our employees, but our employees are so exposed to Bitcoin and digital currency as a career, so encouraging them to kind of go all in Bitcoin I don't think is a great idea. But I should also mention, our company is called Digital Currency Group. That's intentional. It's not Bitcoin blah blah blah. Because I'll be the first to admit that this is incredibly early, and we are big believers in things like Ripple. We're big believers in things like Ethereum Classic. We're big believers in things like Zcash. And so ultimately, whatever is the winner, I think today Bitcoin is the winner, but whatever is the winner, we will hopefully be out ahead of it, and our employees, if they choose to, they'll get paid in it.
Do you see the possibility of the dollar being converted to a digital type of currency?
So is the question, and I don't know who asked that question. Can you?
Here.
I don't know where you are.
We can't see. Okay.
Here.
Oh, okay. So the question is do we see the dollar going away and people using Bitcoin?
No. The real question is, we're talking about technology like blockchain. Could it be that a government like the US government or Mexican government decided to convert their currency to a digital currency?
Yeah, well, so that actually is happening right now. Now, what the governments are doing right now is they're exploring how to essentially create a government-controlled ledger system and enable its citizens to have wallets on that ledger. It'll be the fiat currency. It'll be the euro. It'll be the dollar. That is already happening. I think the cynic would say it's in preparation for things like helicopter money and other ways to stimulate economies, that would be a great way to do it. I think Santander announced yesterday that they are now exploring using Ethereum to convert or to create a kind of a euro or dollar denominated token on Ethereum. So it is happening, but it'll take many, many years to happen.
We're running out of time, I'm afraid. So I know there's a lot of questions, and we should have really foreseen at least 2 hours of Q&A on the subject. So, but just in wrapping up, I would like to thank Barry for the time and for the insights. We only scratched the surface here. I personally believe that we're really at the beginning of something that could fundamentally change things. And in 20 years down the line, we would have the same graph that Eric put up earlier, looking back at the old-fashioned TCP/IP and smiling about it. So hopefully we'll have the opportunity to look back at this and thinking, remember those days in Mexico? So thanks very much, Barry. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.